Good evening, ladies and gentlemen. I'm Marshall Bouton, the president of the Chicago Council, and I am especially pleased to welcome David Sanger back to the Council's platform for the third time in my tenure at the Council. You know, I don't often take over the privilege of introducing someone. But I wanted to do that tonight out of respect for David and for this great new book that he has written. And if you haven't read it, go out and buy it. So only less than 3 years ago, a little more than 3 years ago, less than 4 years ago, as we all know, President Obama entered office facing a wide array of foreign policy challenges. In addition to the very complex and still with him task of dealing with a global financial crisis, the United States had troops on the ground and in combat in Iraq and Afghanistan. The Iranian nuclear program, which is of course also still with us, was a rising concern. Osama bin Laden was alive and well in Abbottabad, Pakistan, and Al-Qaeda was operating not only in that part of the world but increasingly in places like Yemen and Somalia, and many other challenges that I could take time to list but won't. And what is most interesting about, in my view, about David's new book is how he peels back what has been, frankly, in the light of what he discloses, the routine coverage of Obama foreign policy, and allows us to see it in a whole new light. The way this administration has responded to those and related challenges, particularly in the national security arena, which many today would have to admit would have been surprising and unexpected just 3 years ago. In this book, Confront and Conceal: Obama's Secret Wars and the Surprising Use of American Power, David provides us with extraordinary information, new information, and insight as to how the Obama administration went about dealing with these challenges, and in particular, the unveiling, the unfolding of a series of new approaches in the use of new technologies and new techniques, particularly in the war against terrorism, though the administration has stopped, as you all know, using that term, but also in the way we conduct war. It is an effort that, on David's part, that has already attracted a storm in the best and sometimes not best sense of that term, of immediate critical attention and a wide array of critical praise. He has also personally stirred up a hornet's nest of activity among those in the Congress and in the administration and elsewhere who believe that the book has relied on some very extraordinary dereliction of duty on the part of senior officials who have simply walked up to David and told him the whole story, whole cloth, when the reality is that this book is the product, as I know, from having had the opportunity to talk with David about some of these issues over the last several years when we have attended together an annual conference on India, of the very best of investigative journalism. And for any of you who read it, I know that will become very clear to you in the course of your reading. This is, of course, only the latest highlight of an extraordinary career in journalism that David has followed He is today, of course, the chief Washington correspondent for the New York Times. And before covering the White House, he worked extensively on the interface between economics and foreign policy and wrote extensively on how national security must increasingly be viewed through the lens of economics. And of course, today we as a nation are experiencing that very phenomenon in the way that our economic difficulties are threatening to undermine not only our economic competitiveness, but our ability to muster and deploy power in the service of our national interests around the world. For his career to date of journalistic achievement, he has been twice a member of a New York Times reporting team that won the Pulitzer Prize, and part of a team that was a finalist just last year for its coverage of the Japanese tsunami and the ensuing nuclear disaster. And for those of you who haven't noticed in his bio, he spent some time in Japan. He is the co-recipient of the Wendell Prize for diplomatic reporting for his coverage of Iraq and Korea, and the Aldo Beckman Prize for coverage of the presidency. I want finally to say, and this is of course my own opinion, but as I have read some of these criticisms of the book, and particularly of the revelations that come to light in the book, apart from what I've already stated about the fact that this has come from a lot of very hard work, not from a few officials just sidling up and telling him the whole story, there is an intimation in some of this response to the book that somehow this is a true infringement on our national interests and somehow not legitimate. But I want to remind you all that this book comes in a very fine and long tradition of the very best of investigative journalism in our nation. And for those of you, many of you in the audience old enough to remember as I am, the Pentagon Papers being one example. At the time, it seemed explosive and tremendously surprising. And as we look back, we realized that the publication by the New York Times of the Pentagon Papers allowed us to begin to steer a course out of Vietnam in the late 60s, early 1970s. So I'm delighted to have David back. Look forward to his remarks, and as usual, he will answer questions which Sneeve King, my colleague, our Vice President for Programs, will moderate. Please join with me in welcoming David Sanger.
Well, thank you very much, Marshall. Thank all of you for coming out here. And I just wanted to start, before I begin talking about Confront and Conceal and what I've learned about the Obama administration, I just wanted to start briefly by just saying something about my good friend Marshall, because he's announced 2 weeks ago that, just about 2 weeks ago, that he's going to move on after 10 remarkable years here. I've only realized today, based on his statement, that that was a result of his saying, if Sanger comes out here a third time, I'm quitting. So I'm responsible, I'm afraid, for your loss. Marshall has done a really remarkable job, and I think the biggest testament to it is that we have, 300 people in the room here, and I wish I could say it was for me or for the book, but it's really because Marshall has put together such an incredible array of programming here. I mean, you guys would all be forgiven for being completely exhausted by just trying to show up at Marshall's events during NATO. He sent me the list of what was going to be going on here during the NATO summit, and I realized that he had more going on here than the president did. But it's an astounding thing that he has built this up so, with the help of an incredible staff, that Chicago now has one of the premier foreign policy think tanks in the country, that it's not only these programs, but the output of